Our next presenter is Joel Krieger. As head of creative content and experiences for Magic Leap, Joel is exploring the frontier of augmented reality, spatial design, and storytelling. His work seeks to amplify human ability with wearable technology. With a career spanning over 2 decades in interactive media, Joel has previously held design leadership roles in emerging experiences at Razorfish and Sapient Nitro. He also serves on the Sustainable Design Committee for Society of Experiential Graphic Design and is a fellow at the Royal Society of Arts. Please welcome Joel Krieger, everyone.
Thanks for the intro, and thanks for everyone joining us here today. I'm going to give you a bit of context for where I'm coming from before we get into it. So for most of my career, I've been doing spatial design work. I would call it a bit of a different kind of spatial design. Before joining Magic Leap, I worked at a company called Second Story, and for about a decade, we designed and built interactive spaces. So everything like the immersive art installations that you just saw to museum exhibits and corporate headquarters, flagship retail, and even temporal spaces like experiential marketing pop-ups and so on. In 2020, I found myself at Magic Leap, which of course makes wearable AR glasses. And, at first that could sound like a bit of an odd jump, but there was a through line here. So I found myself still designing interactive spaces, except instead of the technology being embedded into the built environment, which is how we did it at Second Story, here you're wearing it. So still immersive environments, but more about practical use cases, more about utility. This is some video from the first application I worked on at Magic Leap. This is called Wildfire. Here we're exploring training and simulation and visualization. Can we enable wildland firefighters, and these were real wildland firefighters you see in the video. And so this idea of, if you can take this data that is, abstract numbers and make them native, make them spatial, allow a team to stand around it, how does that change their ability to understand what's happening and make decisions in a high stakes situation? To Magic Leap Assist, which was the second big app we worked on, this was really exploring different formats for collaboration. So here you have one Magic Leap 2 user and a remote user on a computer, and the guy on the computer is helping this person here walk them through the process of milling a tile on this giant LSAM machine. So he's able to kind of see what he sees and help him pick the right drill bit, show him how to change out the drill bit, circle it, and that same mark appears in a space. And so, Assist is interesting because that use case is pretty well trodden, but here we're trying to explore, hey, can we do this in a different way? So anyhow, after a bit of time exploring the device and just this kind of whole world of wearable augmented reality, I started thinking a lot about my old life at Second Story, and I just kind of thought, if we had a Magic Leap 2 in my old job, it would have changed everything. It would have changed so much about how we did our work. And I started to think a lot about the last major project that I led at Second Story. It was called the Australian Centre for the Moving Image, ACME for short. It's a 1,600 square meter museum redesign in Melbourne. Just a few of the images here of this project. So I found myself imagining, how things would have been different. How would our process have unfolded differently if only we'd had a tool like this? I thought a lot about all the different challenges we faced, and there were many of them, and what we did to move past them. For example, we had all these amazing ideas that we wanted to fit into the floor plan. Well, how do you get everything to fit into this space while maintaining an ideal flow? And how many countless review and iteration cycles it took us, both with our team and with our clients, to get there. And thought a lot about the challenges of helping everyone suss out these more qualitative aspects of 3D designs when you're looking at 2D screens. Like, for example, if I'm in this little nook, is this space going to feel too big? Is it going to feel too tight? It's really hard to say until you see it for real. Or, how do we prove to everyone that, an idea that we've fallen in love with that may be a little ambitious really is possible? And not only is it possible, but it's actually compelling. This is one of my favorite installations from that exhibit. It's called Memory Garden. And you place your hands under these pillars and a beam of light kicks on. And it shines these precious little home movies from their film archive. And it projects them into the palm of your hand. So it's kind of like holding these precious little fleeting moments. And of course, to get here, we had to build a lot of physical prototypes for us to work through how this could work, but also just to convince everyone that this concept was worth pursuing. And of course, that process can take a while, and it can be rather expensive. If you see that giant glass casework in the back right, if we'd had Magic Leap during this project, we would have been able to design that casework on site. So actually go into this actual space, because again, this was a museum renewal, so it's completely redoing what was already there. So there was a pre-existing space, and we could do it at actual scale. So instead of designing a 3D exhibit on flat 2D screens, we're basically walking around inside the shell of the museum. We could have moved these virtual objects around. We could have done massing studies and kind of blocked out the space and really get an embodied sense for how a design feels, which is something you can't do, of course, when you're looking at a screen. So, you don't like something over here? Well, that's all right. Try it over here. You try different configurations on the fly. And instead of, looking at design software on a screen, the way I imagine it would have been like actually being inside the software itself, but in the context of the actual space we're working on. And our team could have done this together. So I think a lot of folks on this call are probably very familiar with how many people it takes to pull off a big project like this. So instead of people collaborating on shared files, but everyone's staring at their own individual glowing rectangle, we could have gathered together in that space around a 3D virtual prototype of our ideas, kind of like those Miro or mural boards, only we're doing it in 3D and we're doing it in real life. So building prototypes, of course, is an important part of the design process. But what used to take days to build in the lab with a physical prototype, you could do with minutes and basically zero material costs. But perhaps the most game-changing part of the whole thing, I imagined us presenting our work to our clients in that actual space. So essentially taking our vision for each exhibit out of our mind, placing it in the middle of the room, and inviting our clients to walk around and interact with it exactly as it would appear if we'd already built it. So when it comes to making great work, you often have to navigate this gauntlet of execution to keep great ideas from being watered down. You got to bring stakeholders together. You got to invite them into the design process. You got to help them see what you see in your mind's eye. And I thought, wow, what a way to make this possible. So once I realized the potential here, we set out to make a tool that would facilitate some of this for spatial design practitioners, that would make some of these scenarios possible. It's called Magic Leap Workshop, and we'll talk a little bit about how it's being used in practice today. But first, I just want to make sure we level set on the technology here, and take a minute to just give a nod to this XR spectrum. So on the one end, we have VR, which I'm sure everyone's very familiar with at this point. But how I would kind of designate this spot on the spectrum is you essentially have a blindfold on to the real world, but you're fully immersed in a digital world. And then in the middle, everyone's familiar with Apple Vision Pro, which is not really AR. It's something called pass-through VR. So it's showing a video feed of your surroundings with digital content in it. So you're not actually seeing the physical world. Your experience of the real world is fully mediated by a screen. And on the other end is augmented reality. And this is where Magic Leap plays. So here we're using see-through lenses to give you direct visibility into your physical world and advanced technology within those lenses. And I won't attempt to describe how it works because honestly, I don't fully understand it, but it enables us to integrate high fidelity digital content into your space. So different kinds of devices, they each have their place as valuable tools for certain use cases. But for many spatial design scenarios, you need full visibility. So a site walkthrough or a collaborative design session requires situational awareness and mobility. And this is possible with this device for a number of reasons. First, of course, you're looking through real lenses, very much the same way that you look through your glasses. And because your experience of the real world isn't mediated by a video feed, you can collaborate more naturally with the people in your space, just like you normally would. And then second, the device is small enough, and they're always getting smaller, so that it doesn't obstruct your view of a person's face. This is really important because something like 90% of communication is nonverbal. So what I've noticed is something as simple as being able to see your client's face and their facial expressions as you work through an idea might be all the feedback that you need. But regardless of where a device or use case fits on the XR spectrum, I think all of this is pointing to something much more significant for spatial design practitioners, because for so long, we've been looking at representations of 3D things on 2D screens. So our work with computers has been all about trying to design 3D things on flat, glowing rectangles. And I think now we're in the early phases of a paradigm shift where we're moving from screens to spatial. So, and with AR specifically, you have these old traditional limitations dissolving, and it's giving way to a much more immersive and natural way to design, where, of course, as I said before, you can do it at scale, you can do it in true 3D space. And I think there are probably many reasons why this matters, but here are a few. The first is, well, this is just a more intuitive way to interact with computers. So if you think about how we interact with 2D screens and the inputs involved, scrolling, tapping, clicking, well, that's very limited, and it doesn't make the most use of, our dynamic human bodies. And design using AR is just more natural. It's like interacting with real objects, just like you do in the real world. So instead of scrolling, tapping, clicking, you have bump, you have nudge, you have squeeze, you have throw, you have infinite options, really. So here's a very basic example of what I'm talking about. This is just me recording, playing around on my desk. I have a real dodecahedron made out of wood and a virtual dodecahedron. And so once we add things like physics and collision and edge detection, the line between a real object and a virtual object really starts to blur. And practically speaking, what this could mean for a design process is that when you can grab and hold and move virtual objects just like real ones. So think about how that might change if you were designing something, say, like you're an architect, and instead of kind of moving things around with your mouse cursor, you have that full tactility. Changes the way that you relate to your designs. Second reason here is that maybe with the exception of our phones with GPS, which of course knows where we are and helps us get to where we're going, most of the screens that we use are not very aware of our surroundings or context. But wearable AR is truly aware, and it is so in a way that screens may never be. A lot of people don't realize this, but a lot of devices like the Magic Leap 2, it's about more than just virtual content being displayed in your field of view. This device has more than 18 sensors and cameras, so there's a really interesting awareness that it can have of your space, your environment. And what can you do with this? Well, here's another very basic example, just general awareness. It knows my walls, floors, and ceilings, which I can then snap content to. So I'm just playing around here with a few virtual renderings of a motorcycle design. I'm snapping it to my table, and there's a little bit of physics when I want to pull it off. It's got a little bit of stick to it. And here I am snapping it to my ceiling. So, of course, that's a very basic example. And then you start to think about use cases. Well, okay, think about, playing around with some sort of museum design. So proximity, it can know, what zone I step into and kind of cue the relevant virtual exhibition layer. And then gaze and object detection. So when I look at an object, it can recognize the object and serve up relevant content for that artifact. And in fact, we've already started building this. This is XR Tour. It's a bit of a taste that we showed a peek at AWE this past week, but there are a series of physical artifacts, and we're playing around with gaze detection and triggering exhibition content based on where you look. And of course, one of the things that I really enjoy most about this is it can be a shared experience, so you can engage with the physical objects, the virtual content, and each other in the same space. You can also play around with different types of content. So I think in this next one, I think there's a clay vase. Yeah, here we go. Yeah, so just different ways to kind of add layers of depth and storytelling around physical objects in a space. So the third reason why this matters, and I think this is a big one, at least for me it is. So in 2D, everything digital kind of blurs together. So right now, I actually I closed these out before we got on the call, but I usually have about 50 tabs in my browser open at any given time. Another example is, and I think everyone's had this experience, someone sent you a cool link to something and you can't remember where they sent it to you. Was it an email? Was it Slack, Telegram, WhatsApp? You can't remember. And the reason why you can't remember is because this digital clutter on flat screens has zero spatial context, whereas AR is more memorable. So everything can be in its right place. And that's because digital things can have spatial context when they're spatial. If you think about memory experts, these are the people that you may have heard about. They could remember like 10 decks of playing cards in a row. How did they do that? Well, they use spatial memory techniques like the memory palace is one. And how this works is you think of a place you're really familiar with. So perhaps this is on your walk home, and you think of a sequential order of locations as you move through this space. So perhaps one is the red kind of flowers on the doorway. 2 is the stoop. 3 is the blue curtain. 4 is where I park my moped, and so on. And at each of these places, you can park a visually rich image, and you can retrieve them in this way. You can retrieve them in order. And this actually works really well. I have a terrible memory, and I've tried this technique, and it does a really good job. There's a reason for this. It's because our minds are kind of like the original spatial computers. It's just how we evolved to process and store information. So AR plays to this really well. So imagine even at the desk scale, breaking out of this, zero spatial context with your virtual content, so you can maybe assign content to different physical objects, different landmarks within your space. And that's a lot quicker way to remember where you put something or to bring something up. So I'm already playing around with this. This is just a snapshot of my desk, file folder, accessible by touching the left drawer of my desk. Perhaps the exit button is always on the right of my computer. And then I really like this idea of assigning behaviors to real world objects that are fixed. So like the light switch in my room, perhaps when I touch that, I'm not only triggering the physical light, but I'm controlling the dimming feature in my device. So it's just a different way to get into a flow with your virtual content. 4, just think for a minute how it feels being tethered to your desktop workstation. So in this mode, you're essentially chained to your desk. Your head is in a fixed position. You're staring at your monitor. and your creativity is really restricted. Uh, there's plenty of studies that show we're at our most creative when we're up and moving around. And my experience of this has been there's a feeling of unbounded creativity. It's more of a free range quality when I'm designing an AR. It feels like I can get into a flow state a lot faster. I can stay in it longer. And I think a lot of that has to do with having freedom of movement. And this means that there are all sorts of new things that we have to think about when it comes to designing both the UI, UX, and the content. So when should things stay world relative, as you see on the left? He's walking away. The content or menu is staying fixed, but it's kind of billboarding towards him. When should things be body relative so they stay with you as you move? Should content or UI be head relative in certain instances? Should it be controller relative, as you see on the right? And maybe the most significant reason here is that with VR, I mentioned before, it's kind of like wearing a digital blindfold. So it can fully immerses you in this other world. But there's a trade-off here because it closes you off from others. Whereas AR, and this is why I really enjoy working in this space, keeps us grounded and connected to the real places we're in and the people, the other people who are in there with us. And so this has there's a lot of significance here and a lot of implications. Like, for example, we can collaborate in a way that's not possible with in other modalities. Think back to like that Miro or mural board example where everyone has their own individual screen. Yes, we're collaborating, but there's this kind of isolated, siloed dynamic happening. Whereas actually standing around virtual artifacts in 3D space right next to other people, it's a totally different way to engage that, yeah, just keeps you present, keeps you here. An example of this is a photo from, we had a full team workshop in LA last year. There's probably 25 or so people in this room, and this is a collaborative session, and I can't remember what activity exactly we were working on, but I filmed some of this. Everyone was kind of drawing, excuse me, an individual drawing. So I filmed this on my phone, actually looking through the device. This was before we had the Spectator app integrated, which allows us to capture the content as you would see it in device on your phone. But what you can see here is that everyone here is very much still inhabiting their real physical space. I have full mobility, so I can walk around and interact with other people. And this is something that I would probably never attempt to do in VR or pass through VR. But because in a way, it feels like I never really left the physical world. There's just this layer on top of it that's enriching what we're trying to do. So I just covered kind of 5 reasons why this shift from screens to spatial is significant. I want to talk about another aspect here that really just started noticing as we were using the Magic Leap 2 and the applications we had created in our own work. And we noticed this both individually and in teams, is that it seemed like we were able to now do things that previously were just not possible. And so in a way, it kind of felt like AR was empowering us with these new abilities. And you might call them superpowers, these superhuman abilities. And you think about our cultural media landscape, all the stories that we tell, they're rich with examples of these. So a lot of characters in our stories have superhuman strength. That's a really common superpower. Well, in AR, I've experienced this as well. I too can have superhuman strength. I can lift a giant skyscraper and move it around like it was nothing, find just the right placement on the skyline and the right orientation. This is a snapshot from an application called GeoPogo. Super speed is another power that we aspire to, especially in our modern work culture. So everyone wants to be more efficient. They want to do things faster. Well, in AR. I can be a speed demon. I would probably win every prototyping race against somebody building things out of real physical materials. When I think back to my old job at Second Story, we used to spend so much time building physical prototypes in our lab. And so I'm often amazed by how fast we can iterate these days using virtual prototypes instead. I really like this one, telekinesis, the ability to move objects with just the power of your mind. So just focus on an object and tell it where you want it to go. Well, in AR, I too can be just like 11. Here I am gesturing to move furniture around in my living room. I barely have to move a muscle. Pretty similar to telekinesis. X-ray vision, so the ability to see through walls, see through solid surfaces. In AR, you can have X-ray vision. This is an app called Argyle, and here you're seeing a development site where you could see the HVAC, the electrical, the plumbing. So imagine, for example, how an interior designer might use this sort of thing in reworking an existing space where they have to work around the pre-existing hidden infrastructure. And probably my favorite is telepathy. This is the power to communicate thoughts and emotions to others. So when we do immersive presentations in AR, to me, it feels like, in a way, like telepathy, because you could show clients your vision and they see it exactly how you see it. And I actually think this is something that creative folks tend to take for granted, is that we have these incredible imaginations, but not everyone else can visualize things in their mind the way we can. So with a tool like this, clients can understand what's in your mind's eye in a way that they never could before. Okay, so we just looked at some principles of the paradigm shift from screens to spatial, and some of the kinds of spatial design superpowers that this might enable. And our team has been working to incorporate these into our latest AR application called Magic Leap Workshop. And so while it didn't start out specifically tailored towards spatial design practitioners, this is the signal that we followed. Originally, it was intended to be more of just a general purpose multi-user collaboration tool. But it seemed like folks that already had 3D in their workflow found this really, really useful. So we thought, hey, let's dial it in here, but let's make something that is easy for all types of spatial design practitioners to at least get a toe in the water. So, if you go too far down one of these paths, it might not be so usable for another. But you have your usual suspects here. You have architects, interior designers, exhibit designers, and so on. But also want to think about the unusual suspects. So people who may be designing theater performance, blocking out where the actors stand, thinking about how the scenography comes together. So theater and performance, and then people on the build side as well. So how would this work for developers and fabricators? So once we had a beta version of the application, I called up a friend of mine, David Schwartz, who's one of the founders of Hush. They're a fantastic interactive physical digital design studio in New York. They do really incredible work. And, I thought of them because it seemed like what we had made would be really useful specifically for the type of work they do. And so I asked him, I said, hey, would you be interested in doing a pilot with us? We'll, give you early access. We'll get you up to speed on the device. And, we just want to see how you use it and get your feedback. Fortunately, they said yes. And this turned into a really fruitful partnership. It turns out that they had a real project they wanted to try it on. And their client was Devco, is a not-for-profit developer. And they had this new life sciences campus called the Helix in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And you can see one of those installations in the courtyard there, the red spiral piece there. So this campus had these beautiful, epic, interactive physical installations. One in the campus in the courtyard here. This is called the Paseo, and another one, for example, in the lobby. And so there's some really ambitious work here. And we worked with the team, kind of got to see them working through the various stages of prototyping and development. And I'll play just a little bit of video here and I'll talk over. It was really interesting to see them use this in so many different phases of the design process. So you just saw some kind of like whiteboarding, virtual whiteboarding, a lot of prototyping and iterating on shape and form, playing with moving image. Moving image feels very different at scale than it does small, and especially on a screen. Playing around with dollhouse views. So the same type of thing you'd expect to see maybe an architectural model of, but of course that takes quite a bit of time to build. And here, you get the same effect virtually. One of my favorite things we did was we rented a warehouse and invited all their clients to come step inside the designs. So we had everything at scale. And so they're viewing these designs for the first time as if they'd actually been built. And they had been seeing these on screens up until this point. It was a pretty incredible experience to watch. And of course, as I reflect on that experience, we learned so much about this process from working with the talented team at Hush. I really, for me, I loved seeing a lot of the iterations and how quickly this enabled teams to explore different variations of an idea, and of course to play with things like scale, even when you're in your own studio. But by far, the biggest value, the biggest signal we got was this moment of doing an at-scale design review with clients. Everyone wants to quantify this sort of thing. I think it's actually quite hard to quantify, but I'm sure the value is enormous. If you watch the case study video, it's online, you'll hear the clients talk about how some of these installations were a bit ambitious, and maybe they weren't so sure that they wanted to go through with it. They didn't quite believe, and after they saw it for themselves, they didn't have to trust anyone anymore. It became a matter of, oh, I now see what you see. I can understand how this would work. This is actually going to be really amazing. And they're able to inspect it from all sorts of perspectives and angles in a way that you would never otherwise be able to. And so this idea of being able to massively shorten the number of review cycles that you have to go through because everyone's on the same page about what it is we're proposing. And then, of course, the save material costs from not having to do so many physical prototypes is a big deal as well. So anyhow, both of these applications, I played a video of the assist one at the very beginning, and this, of course, was Workshop, the one on the right. Both of these are free to download and use. If you have a Magic Leap 2, you just go on the home menu and you click on the featured apps button. It's got a little star on it, and you can download those to your device and get started playing around. And I really think about these as a toe in the water. They're pretty broad in terms of the types of things, the types of use cases you could try them out for. But it's a really, really good way to just get started, kind of learn by doing. So that's it for me. There's the link if you want to follow up after this. And I think we can take questions.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. That was so interesting. All right, we're going to take some Q&A. There's already some questions in Crowdcast. I'll take some of the top voted ones. And if you've got more questions, please ask. I'm going to start with this one on getting started. What is the best way to get started? Are there some easy ways to get a toe in the water and start experimenting for ourselves?
Yes. So probably the best, if you have a device, I would download Workshop and pick a project where you have some existing assets, and I would just import them. It's very easy. There's a web interface, so you're able to start up a session. We pay for all the cloud costs and the file transfer costs. You can start up a session. It could be solo, it could be shared, and you can link your computer to the session, and you can just drag and drop 3D designs. Of course, there's limited number of file types that we support at this point, but it's broad enough to where it's pretty useful. You can just drop them into your web window and they'll appear in the session, and just get started playing around with that. I mean, I think that even if you don't have existing designs that you want to explore, just getting in and kind of doing, I really enjoy it in the early stages of a conceptual process. So just being being able to concept ideas with other people, even if they're not physically located in the same space as you. So you can actually join a workshop session if you're remote as well. Um, I really enjoy that because the reality of our world now is a lot of people are hybrid, and it's really rare the whole team's in one place at once. And so for me, it's just a lot different feeling of actually having somebody here in my room as we're working through something than it is just trying to do it through Google Meet or Zoom.
Great. The next one's similar. A lot of these questions are on getting started. What if your assets aren't 3D assets or your skill set isn't necessarily 3D? So this next question is your tips on learning to transition from 2D UI design to spatial design like this.
Mm. Yeah, so if your workflow isn't already 3D, yeah, I don't think that that matters so much. I mean, that's just kind of that's just the signal we picked up on because when we did some internal piloting of workshop throughout our company, we had all different types of teams using it. I mean, people were using it for everything from virtual happy hour to presentations. It's a pretty general use tool, but we just saw an extraordinary appetite for anyone who had any sort of 3D in their existing workflow. But, for example, I'm not sure what kind of work you're in, but let's say your practice to date has been designing more like phone mobile application UI or something like that. I think it's great just to go ahead and start playing around with, if your interest is in developing more AR type applications, even playing around with 2D assets and 3D space will really start to flex your mind in terms of how you think about design and the that sort of thought process you take back with you when you're working in Figma or something like that. So really the if you don't have any sort of 3D existing 3D assets, I would say don't let that stop you. Just start playing around.
Mhm. There's another interesting question here around skills as well, asking about design and materiality and fabrics and whether having those skills is important to succeed in this industry. So interested in some of your thoughts on additional skills that you may not necessarily think of as tech skills, but that are design related or tactile.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, that's actually the tactility and materiality are probably things that I don't think this replaces. So, there's if you're designing exhibits or if you're an industrial designer, there are some things that AR is going to be good for and some things that you're still going to want physical prototypes, and I think material is one of them. I'm not sure I fully understood the second part of that question. It was around other. Could you repeat that for me, Ramona?
Well, so the question here is, do you think it's necessary to learn about interior design and materials or fabrics in order to succeed in this new industry? And I think that there's sort of a broader question around these non-technical skills that are useful.
The first industries who are gravitating towards this happen to be people like industrial designers or interior designers, and it's because they're already thinking in 3D, and this is just such a natural step of what's next for them. But kind of going back to the slides I presented about the paradigm shift. I mean, I think that eventually this is going to replace a lot of the way that we interact with computers. So it doesn't matter what sort of profession you're in. A lot of things will be spatial in the future. And I don't, it's hard to speculate on how long from now that's going to be. But because it's such a more natural way to interact with things, and this is kind of, in a way, this period where we've been interacting with stuff on these flat screens is not natural. For all of human history, our craft, our practice, no matter what job you're doing, we're up and around, moving in the world. And so in a way, this is a return to that. And so I would say it doesn't really matter what skills you have or what I'm assuming that the person asking this question is some sort of designer that, yeah, it's going to be a big enough, broad enough sea change to where you will benefit probably no matter what sort of design practice you're in.
Hmm. Hmm. This is, I think, sort of related, a good follow-up. What might you say to someone who loves design but feels intimidated by the technology? Is there a hope that this kind of tech that you're addressing is going to become so user-friendly that that it'll benefit them?
Mm. Well, I'm one of those people, if it makes you feel any better. I'm not a super technical person, and I know that may sound odd because I just showed you a bunch of highly technical stuff, but I work with a lot of engineers and a lot of very technical people, and so I don't um yes, it can be intimidating. There's a lot to sort out, but I think a lot of that has to do with the pressure we put on ourselves when learning something new. Um, I, yeah, I like the idea of just getting in and playing around without expectations, and you'd be amazed at how quickly you progress when you remove the expectations for where you should be at a certain point. Um, yeah, and two, I know that probably cost is the thing that might prohibit people from playing around, but if you don't want to purchase a device, and there are places you can go, like a lot of trade shows, and you can try a lot of different devices. That's a good like AWE conference just happened last week. That might be a good way to do it. And there are a lot of really inexpensive devices on the market. So maybe AR is something that you're really really interested in, but you want to start with maybe a $200 device that's a pretty run of the mill VR device, and you'll at least that's a start. And so um, yeah, I I wish I had a few more insightful things to say, but just want to let you know that yeah, I hear you and I understand, and I feel like I'm that sort of person too, and I don't usually take to the new technology very quickly, and I have to kind of make myself try out things, and it's once I get excited, once I see, oh, there's some aspect of this that feels really relevant and exciting that I find useful, then I feel like that kind of curiosity takes over the feelings of kind of being overwhelmed and that sort of thing.
Hmm. Hmm. There's another question here that's really meaty and has about 6 questions combined, but part of it I think is really interesting. We haven't touched on it yet, which is around accessibility. So, what if someone's unable to use the controllers? Will they be able to control their environment through other means?
Yes. Yes. So the controller in a lot of those videos, you'll see me using the controller. Just I like it, and there's a very um, fine-tuned kind of precision that you can get with it, like you would any sort of other implement. Like think about your stylus on a tablet with your computer. But yeah, there are a lot of different ways to input. So hand gesture is one, and I think I had one clip where I was using gestures. Gaze is another one. Voice is another one. So there's I think probably the a really rich area in terms of interacting with this stuff is the multimodal inputs. So it's like um, gaze and voice, for example, or combining inputs. I think that's one way to do it. And from an accessibility standpoint, I mean, there have been people doing really interesting things on this, especially for people who have limited vision abilities, how this can augment that. Think about, for example, the object recognition that I talked about. If you can't make out with your own eyes what you're seeing, but the device can and can relay that with the audio, then that's enabling a different kind of experience for them altogether.
This is a good one. Do you think we're going to get to a point where we don't need a screen to see the AR content? Think about Iron Man, Marvel, and how Stark manipulates the holograms that pop up. Right now, we have AVP MetaQuest, so our phone screens, or our phone screens, so like Pokemon Go, etc. Will we ever have the AR and holograms popping up from our wristwatches? Or
Probably. I would say, yeah, it seems kind of inevitable at some point. I mean, I would say, all right, the question talked about, are we going to ever have this without screens? I would say we have it now without screens. Any device that uses optical see-through, like Magic Leap, you're looking through glass lenses. I mean, there's a lot of tech in terms of how the layers work together and how the light's running through it, but that's made possible without looking at a screen. You're still looking through something, and of course the field of view is getting bigger. The devices are going to continue to get smaller and the field of view gets bigger. But yeah, in terms of holographic things just kind of popping up, man, yeah, that seems to be the holy grail of this whole thing. uh yeah, it's hard to predict, but I would say that probably at some point that will likely be a thing. In my previous work at Second Story, when I was mostly focused on, designing interactive spaces where you embed the technology into the built environment around you, we were very interested in that sort of thing, but it always comes down to cost. And the thing that's so interesting about the wearables is it doesn't matter how big the space is. One device can augment my experience of that whole space. Whereas if I want to have, holograms appear, all over the place, it's each moment. That's a big material cost. So there is something, um, yeah, liberating, I guess, about you're not really confined to any sort of set hardware costs in a given square footprint if you're wearing the device and looking through something.
Mhm. Okay, I think we may be getting up on the last question now, but here's one. I'm exploring XR and AR as an in situ extension of live performance. What would you say are amongst some of the biggest challenges to consider from the technology POV?
For live performance.
Hmm.
Hmm. Yeah, some of the biggest challenges are probably going to be around the multi-user. So if you're doing performance, there's an audience, and so that means certain things in terms of how many devices you'd need and the sort of tech infrastructure to facilitate that. Probably the other technical thing to work through is what's possible from a rendering standpoint and a processing standpoint. So on the Magic Leap 2, the compute comes in the compute pack. It's like a disk, and that based on the requirements of battery life and mobility, it's there's going to be a limit to the fidelity of images, let's say, or videos or whatever. But you can do things like remote rendering, so you can have all the processing taking place on a computer or a series of computers that are on site or in the cloud, and that totally changes the kind of the bandwidth of the pipes and what you're able to do on device. So now we're not asking so much of the compute pack that people are wearing. Um, all of that heavy work is happening somewhere else, and of course um, there's some technical know-how to be able to put that together. But yeah, people are doing really interesting things in the space. If you're into performance, I would recommend looking at Kagami, which is by a group called Tin Drum. They did a really fantastic performance piece where it's like it's a volumetric video recording of a famous pianist um, performing a concert, and there's ambient effects, and you can get up and walk around the performance. It's really great. So I would definitely, I think more and more there are people doing that sort of thing with with this device for performance, and I think that's because those folks that are designing and building immersive experiences, I mean, they're used to pioneering, they're used to trying something new, so they're going to have a lot more ambition and risk tolerance than say a large corporation would. So I just think right now there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in that space.
All right, great. And the last question here is, do you think architect turned UX designer could be a bonus point to get into this field?
Architecture and UX design, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I would say, a lot of the folks that I've hired into our team have come from different sort of physical design backgrounds, and I think it's because they're just used to thinking spatially, and so yeah, I would say that architects, interior designers, industrial designers, anyone who's been designing any sort of 3D thing would have a natural head start in getting into the space, as would folks who have designed more traditional interactive things. So people who have been designing websites and or mobile applications. I mean, there's still, while it's not spatial, there, you coming from that world would know things that, for example, the architect wouldn't about interface design and flows and that sort of thing. So yeah, I would say that both of those are great starting points.
All right. Thank you, Joel.